Do you struggle with overthinking? Watch today's video where I'll go through 5 questions to help you stop overthinking. My name is Diana Garcia. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Florida, owner of a private practice called Nurturing Minds Counseling. All right, let's jump into this week's video. All right, let's start off with what is overthinking. So overthinking is simply when your mind has taken hold of a situation, whether it's a decision, whether it's just a scenario, and just starts to kind of overanalyze it, right? And so really sometimes that can look like kind of replaying or ruminating about something related to this decision, about the past. It can just be really thinking about all the possible scenarios, all the worst case scenarios, all the details, all the nuances. And the overthinking part, clearly that's subjective, right? No one can tell you when it's overthinking, but clearly when it's gotten to the point where it's no longer helpful planning and you're just like worrying and overthinking about it and like just still repeating the same patterns of thoughts over and over and over, it's clearly a clue that you started to overthink it, because at this point you've just going over and over in your head. You're not coming to a solution. You're getting really stuck. You're feeling overwhelmed. At that point, this pattern of thinking is no longer really helping you. Below, how do you know you're starting to overthink? That you've gone from just like helpfully thinking about a situation or planning to now it's starting to look like overthinking. What are the clues for you that that's the case? Okay, question number 1. I really want you to start to get ahead of some of this fear and anxiety. So ask yourself, like, what's the absolute worst thing that can happen, right? So related to this situation, this decision, like really start to get ahead of like, what is driving some of this fear here, right? So when you think of worst case scenario, maybe you've already done this, right? Because it's pretty common to engage in some catastrophizing when we're thinking of anxiety. But if you haven't, it might be really helpful to really get a sense of what is it about the situation that feels so scary and overwhelming, right? And once you go down that rabbit hole, like what's the absolute worst case scenario about the situation, then really get a sense of like, okay, if that's the worst thing, can you handle that? Can you deal with that, right? So start to get ahead of maybe some of these unknowns or your anxiety is telling you could potentially happen. So you feel a little bit more of a sense of preparedness and clearly recognizing that even though you're thinking of the worst case scenario, it doesn't mean that's actually going to happen, right? But if it does, that you have a sense that, okay, you knew this could potentially happen and it's okay, right? And maybe the worst case scenario is some uncertainty, and maybe that's the piece, right? It's that you don't know what the worst thing is. And so just acknowledging it. So I think it's really helpful to just acknowledge the fear when it comes to some of this overthinking, if there's some fear involved. Second question, it's kind of like mixed 2-part question, but like what's within your control and what's outside of your control, right? So when we start to overthink situations, we really start to get in our head and we start to get confused. Okay, like in this situation, what do I actually have control over and what do you don't have control over? And that's going to be a clue, because the things that you have control over, then you can decide, okay, if these are the things that I have control over, how do I move forward then? Like what are the behaviors I want to do and the things that I have control over? The things that I don't have control over, then accepting that there's nothing you can do in those scenarios, right? So like that radical acceptance, which is really, really hard sometimes, but accepting like there's parts of this scenario that you just might not have any control. Again, and that feeling of uncertainty or lack of control might feel really uncomfortable, but that's okay. At least you know then what's within your control and what's not within your control. The question really is related to the last one, but what feelings do you have to make space for or accept, right? So going back to this uncertainty, like what you have control or don't have control, when you realize that there's certain things that you don't have control, is there a feeling of just overall uncertainty that feels uncomfortable, or powerlessness, right? And that just feels really uncomfortable to sit with. But if you can acknowledge what are the feelings that you have to start to accept about this situation, maybe there's some limitations in that there's only so much that you can do, right? And so having to accept that piece feels really uncomfortable for you. But if you can name like, okay, I need to start being able to sit in this feeling of uncomfortability or uncertainty, okay, then that's going to start to help you redirect. Like if I can accept this, then my thoughts are going to continue to do what they do, but at least I know that when this feeling shows up, maybe it's fear that you need to accept. Again, whatever those feelings are, if you can start to name that so you have a better sense of what's your role and how you react to some of these feelings. Also, very concretely, is there a deadline to make this decision, right? So sometimes we can really start to overthink, especially if we have a lot of time. You can just spend all this time going over and over and over. And so again, it's this helpful balance, because I don't necessarily want you to procrastinate making this decision, but give yourself a deadline. Like if there is a deadline, right? If there's a concrete deadline, obviously, and it's pretty soon, then maybe you do have to spend some time looking at this decision. But if you have a little bit more time, maybe set a time to really really start to think about it. And you can do what's called a worry time, which I'll do another video on that. But for now, I just want you to have a sense like, is there a deadline to make this decision? If there is a little bit more time, then give yourself permission to not spend all your headspace thinking about every single waking moment about this decision. You can set some time to think about it. Give yourself a deadline then, right? Like give yourself an informal deadline of when you want to make this decision about whatever is going on. And it isn't necessarily a decision that you have to make a deadline for, it's just something that you're generally overthinking. Then acknowledge that there isn't a deadline, and that really giving yourself a sense of like, well, you can think about this endlessly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that anything's going to really change unless you're gathering more information, right? Unless you're like in this research stage regarding this whatever situation or decision that you have to make. Next question, it's really starting to ask yourself, what is it that's keeping you stuck in the rewind mode, right? So when we're thinking of overthinking, whether it's like you haven't made a decision yet, or you're just like struggling to think of all the possible scenarios and kind of really get a clear sense of what feels right to you, really start to think about what is it that's keeping you stuck. Is it that you're missing information, right? Is there something about the scenario that you just don't know yet? Is there something about the scenario that's new and unfamiliar or outside of maybe your expertise or knowledge, and maybe you need to seek maybe some help or professional assistance, whatever the decision or situation is? Again, is it more just like fear and uncertainty and that feels really uncomfortable? Is there a fear of like maybe displeasing others? Other people might not agree with your decision or the situation. So really getting clear, what is it that's keeping you really stuck? Does it just also feel like it's better to overthink this because maybe there's a sense of control? Again, sometimes when we're overthinking it, at least we start to convince ourselves, well, we're doing something, right? Maybe we have more control because we keep overthinking it, versus accepting that maybe you don't have as much control, right? Referencing some other questions. Again, so really starting to acknowledge, like identify what are the barriers that's keeping you really stuck in this rewind mode, so then you can problem solve the different barriers, whatever they are. Actually write these questions down and journal on these different questions. Maybe it's helpful to just talk these questions out with a friend. Maybe it's just all internal. However it works, to really encourage you to take whatever questions work for you, leave the ones that don't. And my goal is that some of these questions will help to really stop getting so stuck in the overthinking. You can watch this video next to help you when you notice you're starting to catastrophize, which I know can feel counterintuitive because one of my questions was to kind of help you catastrophize. But either way, I encourage you to check this video out anyways. And as always, I encourage you to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul, whatever that looks like for you. Thanks, guys.